For Creamer Media's Polity, I am Shannon Ryhove, researcher and analyst. Professor Raymond Suttner joins me to discuss scandals and betrayals in South African politics. Welcome, Raymond.
Thank you.
Now, you refer to abuse and also to indifference to the plight of the poor, as well as to those who were killed at Marikana. Many of those against whom you direct your charges were comrades of yours. Did you maybe misjudge their qualities?
Well, I have not mentioned individuals generally because I've tried in this period since I have come into disagreement not to mention names because I feel that everyone makes their own choices. I don't really want to get into evaluations of people's personalities and things like that. I'm really dealing with decisions that people took as a whole, amongst whom there are categories of people who I would specifically mention. But what I think is important is to ask oneself how it is that people who come from communities who are amongst those who are suffering under the present government, who joined a movement where they sacrificed greatly and faced great danger in many cases, or were imprisoned or tortured, all of these things on behalf of the poorest of the poor, now associate themselves with policies that are negatively affecting that very constituency with whom they were connected, for whom they did everything that was important in their lives. Now, you have the ANC, when you talk of the people who are voting for, leading, making decisions, or endorsing decisions today, it's not exactly the same ANC. Certainly it's not the same as in the 1970s, 80s. It's not also the same as in the initial onset of freedom. In fact, you've got members of the Nationalist Party who've come into the ANC. And one must ask, one must accept that people who were in the Nationalist Party are capable of changing, capable of becoming Democrats and non-racial, etc. But what is interesting to me is that they may not be required to change when they join an ANC that has turned its back on its own constituency. It may well be that some of these people feel completely at home with the type of intrigue that is going on, the corruption, the patronage, the undemocratic behavior, the failure to care for the most vulnerable sections of the community. So in some senses, it may not have been so great an adaptation these people have made. Nevertheless, my experience is that the members of the Nationalist Party who go into the civil service and other things are very anxious to please. And I think it's not just because they've gone into an ANC-led government, but I think the pattern of politics in the Nationalist Party was one of deferring to leaders in a very over-respectful manner. And ANC quite likes that sort of thing as well. ANC leadership quite likes that sort of thing of someone fawning over them and things like this. But I also remember in around 2000, I was at a conference of ambassadors in London, and Sipho Pitjana, who was then the Director General, asked the ambassadors, what would they do? What is their loyalty? Is it to the government of the day no matter what? Or what is the situation? Now, the view I took is that my first loyalty is to the Constitution. That if the government of the day were to act illegally or to invade a country or some such thing, which is contrary to international law, not our law, or it is our law as well, I would be bound not to obey it. Now that's the principle from the Nuremberg trials, that you have an obligation not to abide by an illegal order. Now, most of the people from the old regime who were ambassadors had no problems about supporting the government of the day, no matter what. That was what they were going to do. But there was one leading ANC person who attacked me and said I was legalistic in what I was saying. So, you know, there's a culture that has emerged whereby the respect for legality, the respect for ethics, the respect for the values under which people joined the ANC has been undermined, and is illustrated by that. So it doesn't really matter whether you come from the ANC or the National Party. What shocks me, however, is that some of these people come from the very constituencies who are suffering most. They can see in them people like their own mothers and fathers, like their own children. When they read of a child falling into a pit toilet, when they read of old people not being able to get clean water, or shacks being demolished and having nowhere to stay, surely they must see that those people are in fact variants of their own family.
Now, you also indicate that in some respect people in leadership, including yourself, were not properly prepared for governments.
Yes, you know, in the 1980s, right until 1989, many of us were involved in insurrection, in trying to overthrow the state. And we had to focus on that, because if someone came to ask me, what should I do about this, that and the other, what you advised could lead to that person being killed or arrested or tortured, or other people being arrested, tortured, and so on. So you had to focus. Insurrection is something that people may see as just violence and just trying to perform a military act, but you have a responsibility. Once you're in it, you have a responsibility to those with whom you work, and we focused on that. Now, late in the 1980s, the ANC did develop certain policy documents, but in the period of transition, a situation developed where I don't think ANC policy developers foresaw how what they had developed in terms of policy would be implemented by government. Already by Ready to Govern, that document, I remember asking Ketso Gordon, but this thing isn't a full policy. And what they've done is they just narrowed it down to a summary. And in effect, when government came there, the government ministers made policy. They often brought in people who had been in the anti-apartheid struggle, but it didn't pass through processes within organizations, as was the case with GEAR. So you had that type of problem, but you also had a problem that we did not think of what it meant to run a modern state of our type, according to the values that we wanted, democratic and transformatory. And unlike countries like DRC and most countries on the continent, South Africa is one of the few places that has a tax base that can support a bureaucracy. In many of these states, even if a civil servant wants to be honest, there is not a salary coming at the end of the month because they don't have enough taxes to pay it. Now, South Africa had that tax base, but we didn't have a proper debate about how we wanted the bureaucracy to operate. Consequently, we adopted the centralized, hierarchical ways of operating that we inherited from the apartheid regime. Some people will say, no, when they came into some or other security services, the ANC brought in democratic values and all of these things. My impression, however, is that there was no real debate about how a transformatory and democratic service would operate, how what happened at the bottom would be fed up to the top, and there would be this interrelationship in the making of decisions. So I think we didn't really have the chance, many of us, some people did think about it, but the process of government, the period between insurrection and negotiations, in fact they overlapped because some talks were secret, but the period before elections was very short, and I don't think that we were adequately prepared, and that may be one of the reasons why some of the problems that we have today are there.
Could we still be having those debates?
Yeah, we could be having those debates, but it's quite hard if you're saying the way the civil service operates is problematic. You can't, it's very hard when people have job descriptions, all these things, and they've been doing it for 21 years. You see, my impression is that there was institutional memory from the apartheid regime. Now, my view is that institutional memory should have been completely reevaluated. And I don't think it was, and I think that although different things were implemented, the ways of functioning were very similar to that of before.
Well, thank you very much, Raymond.
Thank you.
That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about scandals and betrayals in South African politics.